So guys, let's coming back to the history of Jiu-Jitsu, the series that I'm doing, and I'm gonna keep going with that. So we're going to episode number 6, the Gracie and Jiu-Jitsu in the 20s, in 1920s. And before we start, I want to say thank you one more time to my sponsor, Spider Korea, and also to Elton Silva, who wrote Muito Antes do MMA, a book about the martial art history, including Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, and it's a book that is soon will be, an English edition, and it's a great, great, great book. So uh, let's start now. Okay, so we finished talking about the first Japanese in Brazil and how they start to teach jiu-jitsu even before Mitsuyo Maeda, and today we're gonna go with the Gracies and in the 1920s when they moved from Belém to Rio de Janeiro. So first, the first Gracie Academy dates back to the early 1920s. Coming from Belém do Pará, the Gracies settled in Rio de Janeiro, and there were several versions about its beginning. Some sources point out the involvement of Donato Pires dos Reis in the creation of the Jiu-Jitsu school, which predates the one located on Marquês de Abrantes Street, supposedly the family's first academy. Several elements in interviews given by Carlos and Donato Pires in the early 1930s allow us to determine the existence of this school. Carlos stated that before becoming a jiu-jitsu instructor for the civil guard of the state of Minas Gerais, he taught self-defense classes to a group of students at his gymnastics academy in Rio de Janeiro. It is important to say that in the early 20s in Brazil, the term gymnastics was used to designate various sporting methods, including martial arts and combat sports. So, in addition to that, Donato stated in interviews that he had a jiu-jitsu academy previous to the one in Abrantes Street. So most likely, the first academy emerged sometime between 1926 and 1927. Apparently, teaching jiu-jitsu at that time was informal and a privilege for few students. And when Carlos and Helio they say that they had an academy, a gym, and the first Grace Academy was in the 20s, they are telling the truth because they are talking about this old school even before the Abrantes Street School, which is the famous one that they opened in 1930 with Donato also. And if you wanna know who is Donato Pires dos Reis and all this history previously, go to the episode 5 before that. So during the period, Carlos and his brother, in addition to being involved with jiu-jitsu, they also training in other sports. Helio, just 14 years old, already trained in high-performance water sport like rowing and swimming, becoming a swimming champion between 28 and 29. In the mid-20s, the Grace began to practice boxing and wrestling. And in 27, George Gracie, age 16, competed in amateur boxing championships against older and more experienced opponents. Carlos would also have been involved with the boxing, being stated by his brother Helio as a champion of the sport. And it's funny that Helio mentioned it as a child that he used to see his brother Carlos come home with injured face because of his violent boxing matches. Donato Pires also was involved with amateur boxing during the same period. And also in the interviews that Osvaldo Gracie gave in the 1930s, the decade of 30s, he recalled his involvement with wrestling in the previous decade, so in the 20s. Most likely, George, who was coached by Osvaldo at this time, was also involved. So, Osvaldo, remember when he gave some interviews that we found in old newspapers in Rio de Janeiro from the 30s that he was training wrestling in the 20s, and for sure, he was teaching George also. And in the late 20s, Donato Pires dos Reis, an old training partner of Carlos at the Coma Academy in Belém do Pará, like we said in the previous episode, invited Gracie to help him teach Jiu-Jitsu classes at the Polis in Belo Horizonte, the city of Belo Horizonte in Minas Gerais state in Brazil. Later, Carlos travels to São Paulo, where he meets the famous fighter Geo Omori. This brought Carlos closer to a much more professional aspect of fighting, evolving technically throughout his experience with the Japanese master. And Carlos, as well as George and Osvaldo, even trained with the Japanese master, mixing what they had learned with Maeda to Omori's techniques. So that's a fact that many people don't know, that even that Carlos, late, he fought Omori. He also trained with him and together with him and his brother, and that was very important to the development of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And talking about Omori, Geo Omori was a Kodokan black belt and Japanese professional fighter who arrived in Brazil in the mid-20s after living for many years in the United States, where he participated in hundreds of fightings against wrestlers, catchers, and boxers. One of his most famous fights in Brazil was against Carlos Gracie, like I said before. And in 1926, Omori opened a restaurant in the neighborhood of Brás in São Paulo. So he came from US, I think he came from San Francisco, to retire in Brazil, and he moved to São Paulo. And in Brás, is a downtown neighborhood pretty famous in São Paulo. He opened a Japanese restaurant to just retire and finish his day as a restaurant owner. But the venture was not successful, and he started to fight challenge again. So he performed at Circo Queirolos, becoming a sensation. Geo Omori's high popularity caught the attention of Carlos Gracie and generate a fundamental exchange in the development of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And during this period of time, the Gracie had several important experiences, starting a process of transformation and creating the basis of a martial art that would become later known as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In the following decade, the 30s, the technical evolution of the great Jiu-Jitsu would develop in a very eclectic and complex way, being perfected through the use of various resources absorbed from another martial art, such as capoeira, the Brazilian martial art, and catch as catch can. The teachings of Carlos, which until then were centered on self-defense, become focused almost exclusively in ring fighting. But that's, of course, it's a history for our next chapter when we're gonna talk about the Jiu-Jitsu in the 30s and how it was developing after this contact that Carlos had when he moved to Rio and his brother with all these other guys, like Omori was one of the most important influence in Carlos Jiu-Jitsu. So thank you very much, guys, for listening to the history, and I will come back soon with the episode number 7 when we're gonna talk about the decade of the 30s. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.